Thank you very much for that introduction. I'd like to also say Technopolis in itself is a spin-out from a university in a slightly unusual area, in that we're not sort of a technology spin-out, but a policy spin-out ourselves. And so enjoy looking at these issues in depth as to how these types of organisations can emerge from institutions. So I gave a presentation in Brussels. We had a workshop on the Entrepreneurial University Guiding Framework last month, and my colleague said you have to start by showing people how it all ends up, rather than going through a process and then people guessing how something might end up. So I wanted to show you this. I'm going to take you through the story of the last year. The European Commission have put together a piece of work which we have helped along the way in the production of a guiding framework for entrepreneurial universities in Europe. Now, the idea behind it is that it's a tool that universities can use to assess themselves, their current position, and to reflect on how they see themselves against what we have here, these 7 areas. So we've got leadership and governance, very much around your strategy of your organisation. We have organisational capacity, people and incentives, about those involved, how your organisation is managed, what types of incentives you would need to have in place in order to make something happen. We have entrepreneurial development in teaching and learning, around all the issues around education offering and how this is dealt with within the institutions. We have the pathways for entrepreneurs, which is looking at all the different types of initiatives or thoughts that need to go into the idea of moving from someone coming into the institution either as a student or as a member of staff, and the outcome, which could be that they are themselves going on to become an enterprising individual or an entrepreneur in their own right. It takes you through the process no matter what your eventual outcome is in terms of entrepreneurship. We have the university business external relationship. So this looks at what the university does in terms of its relationships with the external environment. Also, the Entrepreneurial University is an internationalized institution. I think something that is said that a university can be international, cannot be international without being entrepreneurial. And so those aspects are encapsulated in that part of the guiding framework. And finally, and very important, is of course measuring the impact. This is something that's not done systematically and is a very, very important part of a framework and of what an institution might look at, because all of these new incentives or new initiatives or changes that might happen within an institution, it's really important to then find out what you were expecting this change to do in the end. So, overview of the presentation. I'm going to give you a brief background to the study, where it came from, the method that we took, and an introduction to the experts that were involved in the process, and then talk through some of the methodological issues that occurred throughout this process, which I think are very important for universities, and then a presentation of the current version of the framework. This is an ongoing process. We've spent a year producing this pilot, of which it isn't finished. It will never be finished in some shape or form. But it's something that the Commission, I think, are hoping to launch middle of this year, to have something which can be up and running for all universities to use. Having said that, at the moment we have a pilot site up, which I'm very, very happy for any of you to have a look at, and you can have the URL for that and use, of course. So where did this come from? The European Commission runs the University Business Forum, which was set up in 2008. And this is a platform for structured dialogue between stakeholders, allowing for exchange, sharing of good practice and mutual learning. And there are annual forums as well as thematic forums, and very, very much focusing on the university business relationships, not just on knowledge transfer and technology transfer, which was traditionally looked at in much, much more detail, but ensuring that we looked at the education side of it, new skills, entrepreneurship, curriculum development, lifelong learning. this is set really in the context, I'm sure Juliette can tell you more, around the modernisation of universities, the modernisation agenda. And a very, very strong part of that politically was the idea that university-business relationships are intrinsically important for innovation and competitiveness. And so therefore, to look at it in all of its shapes and forms, we needed to do that. We need to do it better. It's not done very, very well. It's not done systematically. And so the Commission started this forum. And it brought together some really interesting people. And over the last few years, we've seen some forums which have come out with some very, very strong conclusions and recommendations for what we can do at the European level to bring this forward. So in March 2011, there was a workshop session specifically on universities as engines of innovation. And this discussed how they can become engines of innovation and build entrepreneurial universities. During that session, they looked at some of the main factors, and the discussion showed that very much looking at the change of mindsets that needed to happen within universities, how it needed to change its orientation, become much more open, the risk-taking attitude, and flexibility in responding to economic and social challenges. Now, I think this is an open debate and also brought up how difficult this is for universities to actually address all of these issues all at once and which ones to take forward. I mean, out of that session, there was the conclusion that, I mean, first of all, it varies across countries, you know, what an entrepreneurial university might mean, and also how they're played out, how important it is for change to happen on all of these different levels. Some of the important aspects that came out included the leadership, very much around the strategy and the top-down thinking that in order to have change, we need change from the bottom up, but it needs to have the support of the top down. And often that doesn't happen because there are other priorities to take into consideration, contextual priorities, the issues of autonomy, things that stop things happening that needed to be addressed. But the discussion was open and wide-ranging, and also it brought up the idea that long-term relationships with the external environment were increasingly important. And one of the big issues was academic motivation that came up in this forum. The idea that you would have to change the motivation for academics to do something different also relied on the incentives that were put forward by the institutions for that to happen, as well as their skills. So therefore, it formulated a recommendation to have a closer look at what the underlying concepts and characteristics in a broad sense of an entrepreneurial university might be, and to come forward with a guiding framework. And this guiding framework would be there not as a checklist that everybody had to look at every single part of it and change, but it would be there for learning and inspiration, of self-reflection, for universities to look at what else is being done, what are all of the different aspects that a university could look at, to reflect on, to go through a process of change if it wanted to. So from recommendation to action, I think this is very important. This was taken up by DG Education and Culture, who commissioned this piece of work to investigate and pilot the idea of a guiding framework. So it wasn't just a recommendation that couldn't be taken up, it was something that was taken up. And the first thought was that this would be made available as an online tool, which is what we have at the moment, but where institutions, university-wide, faculties, departments, anybody within the university could use it to review and assess across a broad number of areas of the institution in light of the entrepreneurial agenda. And the reason this wasn't just about the top level, we know that faculties are sometimes behave as incredibly independent, and so therefore would have a completely different take on their university. But this also brings to light debates about whether faculties individually could use a framework like this and then come together and show how they differently assess and reflect on where they are in terms of being an entrepreneurial university. So just putting some of the context in place, we have a complex, the European higher education area is not a homogeneous area. We have 4,000 undergraduate and postgraduate institutions. I think it actually is 5,600 if you include the 40 countries that are signed up to Bologna. We have a wide variety of institutional forms, obviously governance and funding, not just at a member state level, but at a regional level. There are around 20 million students in the system right now, and there were 4.5 million graduates in 2009. Now, we have, at the moment, in 2010, there were 26% of the population had higher education qualification, and we've got a target to raise this proportion to 40%. And this is a huge challenge. We've got challenges here around the institutional capacity to raise this, and also raising the question around the skills that are necessary, the types of courses and the types of education and learning that we want to put into the increased number of graduates, because we see an issue across Europe of an economic recession, where at the same time we're seeing a lack of jobs, and yet we want to increase this. But we've got China, who have moved, they've trebled their rate of graduates in the last decade, and then by 2020 they themselves will have over 60% of the population of leaving with a higher education qualification. So there are huge pressures, but we need to think about this in the right kind of way. What does this mean? And at the European level, in looking at the European policy targets of not only the 40%, but also of raising R&D and innovation spend, all of this is underpinned by the fact that higher education is seen as central to EU innovation and global competitiveness. So all of these targets are affecting universities. Universities are seen as our way out. And so this is a huge opportunity, but also a threat if we don't do something about it. I just mentioned, I'm sure most of you know about the Bologna process, but in terms of promoting harmonization and modernization of the European higher education, it's been instrumental in helping to create tools that translate, and allow mobility and understanding of qualifications. And some of this work is the foundations in which these particular targets can be set in context. So also after seeing these sort of fundamental changes, we also have a wide range of issues about how universities are seeing themselves. They have to respond to an awful lot of different pressures, competing pressures. I know we've mentioned this morning about the squeeze on public funding, but it shouldn't, we say there's a squeeze on public funding, but you need to look for external funding sources. It needs to be something where you want to diversify your funding base in order to grow and to be independent and to have your own ways of moving forward. I mean, so the philosophical idea of the university and what it means is changing. There is a huge systemic diversity, we know, but finding your place in the new landscape means that you have to look at what you want to be and not to look at what, en masse, at what is happening with a group of universities in a country. You should not be doing the same thing. You should not all be research intensive. You have to look at what your environment wants. And so these changes are also meaning that the challenges, we're much more focused on employability and the student. And from the student, in the UK in particular, the change in the funding and the increase in bringing in of tuition fees has also meant that the students become very, very much the consumer and have a significant role, as they should do, in what their education is, what they learn, and what they're going to get out of it. They want to be employable or to enter into the market, the labour market, with the right types of skills to take them forward. They therefore challenge universities much more in the types of skills that they're learning. And this is a good thing. This is changing the nature and certainly fits very, very well with entrepreneurship education, but is also happening across the board in faculties, that you're having to much more respond. And we also have the case in the UK that it is not just that students are then rating their universities on learning, on the serious side, they're also rating it on all other kinds of facilities. And this is a really, really important marketplace. And it's a big change for institutions to deal with. So on top of this, we also in the UK have a much, much more bigger pressure on measuring impact. We have a new REF coming in, which is replacing our research assessment exercise. And those types of issues are changing the way that academics have to look at what they're doing across the board. It still doesn't have enough in teaching, and on the teaching and learning side, it's still probably too research focused, but nevertheless, things are changing. And we also have this pressure on academic career structures and rewards and recognition that I mentioned. Oh, slipped over. So just on doing this work, I mean, we had a lot to deal with in producing this work, and we brought together an expert panel. Paul Hannon, who is here today, was on the expert panel. We had 6 individuals, representing the whole of Europe with 6 individuals was slightly complex, but we had a good spread of countries represented, and from the side of technology and innovation and entrepreneurship and education, it was all in the mix. And we had some good lively debates within this about coming from very much the theoretical through to the practical implementation of a framework such as this. So on the study itself, so what we had to do to begin with, I'll just briefly explain this. We did a literature review in a good classic sense to find out what it was that was already out there. This is a well-documented area of work, but it's diverse. And so we brought all of that together for the experts to assess and to look at, to decide what was it that was most important and could be most useful across all of these countries in all of these different types of institutions. So we then did a pilot exercise and brought back from the pilot exercise, where we went out to several universities across Europe, the results of that to analyse and refine the framework and to where we are now, which I will get to later on in the presentation. And there's a first set of key issues that were arising from the literature, really. It's complex. There is no definition of an entrepreneurial university. I think that what we do find as well is there's lots of literature that shows you what an entrepreneurial university is not, which is also important. The literature therefore spans a number of different disciplines, as it should: research, education, new public management, technology transfer, economics. There are many existing models which are used, and there are some very, very well-designed concepts out there in their specific environments, but still very little evidence of the importance of some concepts in relation to other concepts. And these concepts are not formulated in a consistent manner, and nor are they generally categorized. But a lot of very, very interesting work out there that we could draw on. I think what we could say is that there are recurring central factors. These are the ones that you would expect to see. The centrality of the stakeholder. This is all stakeholders, the importance of the staff, the students, the leadership. That comes through in all of the different frameworks that we saw. Autonomy, steering, funding systems, culture, big factors involved in how a university has the capacity to change. The entrepreneurship education side was very strong in the literature, and incentive systems that could be put in place in order to do something to change. The relationships with the regional and national environment, internationalization, and knowledge transfer activities, where the majority of the literature tends to concentrate. There was no consistent use of the word entrepreneurial, intrapreneurial, enterprising, entrepreneurship. As we know, to a certain extent, you then have to take that. We've got to deal with some quite different cultural differences. If we have trouble defining it in the UK, it's even harder to define across Europe. And so this is something I think it's very, very important, particularly words like intrapreneurship, which we probably use more commonly than in some countries. And so getting those definitions right from the perspective of a guiding framework such as this is very, very key. And there are also, what we saw is there are many types of activities that are taking place in universities which can be considered entrepreneurial but are not labelled as such at all. And some of this is for universities to reflect on themselves, but very, very important to actually understand what it is you are already doing that perhaps you should look at again and decide is possibly the way forward. Is to take what you already have, which is good, in that it doesn't have to be technology transfer, the creation of startups, and So just to briefly, some examples of the models and definitions that we looked at. I think most of you will know Burton Clark. He had a 5-point scale for 20 concepts, and there were 5 key enabling factors which stand and are something that we can use as part of our framework. The strengthened steering core, the expanded development periphery, the looking towards your external environment, external stakeholders, the diversified funding base, stimulating the academic heartland, and an integrated entrepreneurial culture. Now the integrated entrepreneurial culture is the one that you look at that seems to have the most controversy around it, in that, I think, as was brought up this morning, each faculty, department, individual will have a different idea about what an entrepreneurial culture is. So how do you embed something across a university that can be considered to be a common entrepreneurial culture. It's a difficult one to take forward. There's also a Framework 6 project that was done, which examined the changing roles of universities. It's really interesting to look at because it certainly looked at the internal and the external factors that are contributing to change. So it gives you some of the framework conditions, some of the issues that universities have to contend with. And Alan Gibb in 2006 had a model of where they put forward 3 different models that varies depending on how much a university relies on external resources and how much it's led by internal drive to change. But of course these are updated all the time, and I think the publication that Paul put forward this morning is some of that builds on the work that's done here and gives a much more detailed examples that also are very, very relevant to this guiding framework. So overall, the factors that we identified were organisation and governance, the people, and the external environments and its relationships. But we also looked at the framework conditions, which we can't deal with in a guiding framework because in every member state, in every region, there are different framework conditions and contextual issues which you have to know about and are very, very important and underpin what you can do. So we take them, we look at them, and we put them to one side in developing a guiding framework. But we collected all these factors together for the expert meeting. So there are some assumptions that are built into this guiding framework, which are really, really important because it's for European universities, institutions who are interested in becoming more entrepreneurial, almost whatever that means to them. It's about a process of change. And it doesn't set out to define the entrepreneurial university because you can't, but to enable universities to assess themselves. And so therefore it provides a number of parameters which not all of them are necessarily interesting to that particular university looking at the assessment. But the aim is to enable the institutions to identify themselves, their own situation, and to identify potential areas for action, taking into account their own framework conditions. So the results, therefore, are highly subjective on the individual basis. It's a self-assessment exercise. It is not a benchmarking. I mean, you could, of course, benchmark it against yourself if you want to, if you're looking for the process of change, but you're not benchmarking yourself against universities in Europe. I think that needed to be made very clear right from the start, because we do not want another ranking system. This is for the universities to take away and use, not for anybody else. So therefore, you can use it by having an individual assessing them or different groups of individuals. And the different opinions can, of course, be interesting. When we had the workshop last month in Brussels, I think one of the first things that came out of it was the fact that when all those individuals around the table started talking immediately, asking questions, debating about what it meant and what this meant to them. And that's exactly what it's meant to do. It's meant to be a process where you start to reflect and talk to each other and then decide what you want to take forward. So as that, it can only be used as part of a wider process. You know, it is a tool, it is not a solution. It doesn't tell you how to be an entrepreneurial university in any shape or form. I think in the future, when this becomes a full online system, there will certainly be examples in there, case material, publications that can be used for reference purposes. But everything has to be taken within its own context, and we have to be very mindful of that. So the results derived, as I said, they belong to the university and for their own personal or institutional use. You can, of course, register as an individual without your university even knowing, if you wanted to have a look at it. You could use it in exercises within classrooms. It's up to the individual how they want to use it. So you can access it as many times as you want, and it can provide, as I said, a baseline against future developments, or you can use it for comparative purposes within institutions. So the sample for the pilot exercise, just briefly, we tried to cover all of the countries of Europe in a very small sample. So we selected 137 institutions covering all the member states, and also making sure that it covered not just technical, but arts, humanities, business schools, highly specialised schools, and the comprehensive higher education institutions. At the initial stage, at this pilot stage, it's still quite rough and ready. I think there's broad support for a guiding framework in that universities who started to use it are ready to use it. I think that's saying about the readiness of businesses as well. Universities have to be ready for change in order to use something like this. You cannot take it forward and then say, here, have a look at this and see what we need to do. You need to want to do something. And the institutions who took part wanted to do something. And even those who didn't have time, who we phoned up, said that they thought this was a really, really interesting exercise. So I think that gave us a good indication of the types of that there was going to be support from universities across Europe for this type of tool. At that stage, they thought the expressions that we put forward of parameters and statements around, governance, leadership, internationalization, etc., covered most areas which are considered important for institutions. However, it's difficult to score expressions, including both staff and students. I think that's a very, very valid point, which we've sorted out. We hadn't really thought about it so much at the first attempt. On this, just to say, there's a scale under each question. There's a statement, and then there's a supporting statement which helps you make a reflection, and then a scale of 0 to 10, where you can then give yourself a score on the scale. So you can say you're a 7 or a 10 or a 0 on it. We also thought at the beginning about weighting. This was about the concepts. So some concepts are more important than others, but we couldn't do it because it's too subjective. So I think that has to be up to the university to make a decision about how important the statements are to them. So you could put in weighting yourself if you wanted to, and that's something you could do with the tool. But in general, we thought just generally each statement individually, a scale of 0 to 10, it's up to you how you score it. What we found from the pilot as well is it did need more than one member of staff if you were to fill out the whole framework, which is understandable. But that means that you have to do something around pulling together members of staff potentially to do it properly. And that self-assessment is the right approach for institutions. They were not interested in benchmarking themselves. They were very scared to fill in a framework if the results were going to be made public in any way, shape or form. So we also had some universities who absolutely said they were just playing with the tool. They went in and they played with it, which we wanted them to do. But then they were worried if they were playing with it and they'd given themselves a 5 out of 10, they didn't want to then those results be used against them in any way, shape or form. So I think that's an important point. So at this point, the OECD also have a tool. The lead group in the OECD are working on a university entrepreneurship support tool, much more focused on entrepreneurship than the wider guiding framework. But they'd also therefore done some quite specific work and some quite more detailed material around certain aspects. The OECD were also doing missions into universities to use their own tool and then working with universities and creating reports at the end. So a much more intensive process. But it made sense for these two to join together, and they were very supportive of developing a guiding framework in terms of common content and statements, and that the OECD would then be able to use this within their wider environment as well. So that's just what the OECD conceptual framework looks like. As you can see, it's very similar in terms of areas to the one that we're looking at. Slightly more focused on startup support than we've been there. So just finally, just to show the sort of the process that we went to has led to this final version of 7 aspects, and there's still work to be done on this. I think also in terms of creating more statements around students, I think came up at the workshop that we had last month, which is going to be important to put into place, particularly around the entrepreneurship development in teaching and learning. And so what I think I'll do is just show you a couple of the main statements on sections. So on the section on leadership and governance, I say right at the beginning, that universities use the word enterprise and entrepreneurship in their mission statements, but it needs to be more than a reference, and it often is just a reference. And this section is to highlight some of the important factors that you may consider important to strengthen your entrepreneurial agenda. And so from this, there are just 5 statements that have supporting statements under them, which a university can then look at to say, entrepreneurship is a major part of the university strategy. So, of course, you've already got the issue of what's major. And so there's a commitment at the high level to implementing the entrepreneurial strategy. The The university has a model for coordinating and integrating entrepreneurial activities at all levels across the university. So the faculties and units have autonomy to act, and the university is a driving force for entrepreneurship development in the wider regional, social and community environment. So quite complex questions to answer for a university. I think just on the organisational capacity, people and incentives, so this one we've got more questions, but around the fact that, first of all, the objectives were supported by a wide variety of funding sources and investment, including investment by external stakeholders. So sustainable financial strategy to support entrepreneurial development, so mechanisms in place for breaking down traditional boundaries, fostering new relationships, bringing internal stakeholders together and building synergies between them. So the university is open to recruiting and engaging with individuals who have entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviours and experience. So to people from the external environment, that they have staff development in place, that there are clear incentives and rewards for staff who actively support the university's entrepreneurial agenda, and that the university gives status and recognition to other stakeholders who contribute to the entrepreneurial agenda. So I think from there, I won't go through all of them because I think you will get this presentation, and also I would love you to look at the online tool. But we have at the end the web address for it, entrepreneurialuniversities.eu. You can register on there and have a look through it. Thanks very much.